welcome to today's deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking into something kind of radical. A 15% flat tax. That's for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to use import tariffs to fund direct payments to every adult citizen. You know, with your interest in AI and how it might change things up in the job market, I bet this is right up your alley.
Well, absolutely. It's like everyone's looking ahead and trying to figure out like how we can adapt, to a world where AI might completely change how we work. And this whole concept of flat tax and tariffs and universal basic income, it's definitely one of the most like out there solutions people are talking about.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit.
Yeah.
Let's start with that flat tax. So everybody pays 15%, regardless of income. Doesn't matter how much you make. At first glance, sounds pretty nice, right?
Yeah.
No more crazy tax forms.
Oh, yeah. Simplicity is for sure like a huge selling point. The idea is that it would reduce the administrative burden, for individuals and businesses. It's also often framed as like a fairness issue.
Yep.
Everyone contributes the same percentage, so it sounds fair on the surface.
But is it really fair, though? Because think about it. 15% of a smaller income. That's going to hit a lot harder than 15% of some millionaire's income.
Right, exactly. That's actually one of the main criticisms of a flat tax. It can be regressive. It disproportionately impacts, lower income individuals.
Yeah.
People who are already struggling to make ends meet. I mean, for some people, 15% could be a huge chunk of their income, making it really hard to afford just basic stuff like food and housing.
And wouldn't that actually work against the whole point of the direct payments? Because if the flat tax is putting a bigger strain on people with lower incomes, the payments would kind of just be canceling that burden out, instead of actually providing a safety net.
You're absolutely right. That's a really important point. It raises the question of if this system would actually help with economic inequality, or would it actually make it worse? And then there's the question of if a 15% flat tax would even bring in enough money to run the government, let alone fund these direct payments.
Just exactly. Especially if we're talking about a universal basic income, or UBI, where literally every adult citizen is getting a check regularly. That's a ton of checks.
Yeah, some proponents argue that a flat tax could actually help the economy grow, leading to more people paying taxes over time.
Mhm.
The idea is that a simpler tax code would lead to more investment and entrepreneurship.
Interesting. But it seems like there's still a lot of unknowns there. Even if it did boost the economy, would it be enough to cover the cost of UBI and all the other things that everyone has to pay for?
Yeah, it's hard to say. It would depend on a lot of things, like how exactly the UBI program is designed, the overall health of the economy, any cuts in spending that might happen. We're talking about a huge change to the tax system. It's really hard to predict what could happen.
It does feel like we're already getting into some complicated stuff, and we haven't even talked about the tariffs yet.
Yeah.
Which is where the idea of funding UBI through taxes on stuff coming from other countries comes in.
Right. And this is where it gets really interesting, especially when you consider the global impact and how it could affect trade relationships. Because, let's face it, tariffs aren't exactly the most popular thing on the world stage.
Remember when the Trump administration put those tariffs on goods from China? They collected billions of dollars, but it definitely caused a lot of tension and uncertainty in the global market.
Yeah.
So could tariffs actually be a reliable way to pay for something as big as UBI?
Well, there's a lot to think about there. First, we have to remember that tariffs, while they can bring in money, also make things more expensive for people. When you add a tax on imported goods, those costs usually get passed on to the consumer. And it's everyday people who end up paying more.
So it's kind of like a hidden tax. People might be getting this UBI check, but then they're also paying more for everything they buy. It's kind of a trade-off, right?
Yeah, exactly. And we need to think about who's actually benefiting and who's taking on those costs. And then there's the whole issue of other countries fighting back. When one country starts putting up tariffs, other countries tend to do the same. It's this back and forth that can really hurt the global economy.
Trade wars.
Yeah.
Yeah. Those are definitely not good for stability. It sounds like using tariffs to fund UBI might create more problems than it solves.
It's a valid concern. And it really highlights how important it is to look at this from all sides. We can't just focus on the potential good things about UBI. We need to think about the potential bad things that could come with how we pay for it.
So we've got this flat tax that might not even bring in enough money.
Yeah.
And could really hurt people with lower incomes. And then we've got tariffs that could make things more expensive for everyone. And maybe even start trade wars. It feels like we're walking through a minefield of economic stuff.
Yeah, it's definitely complex, and it's easy to get lost in the details. But it's really important to remember that we're talking about real people's lives here. These decisions about policy could completely change the way our economy works and how people navigate the job market, especially as AI starts to play a bigger role.
For sure. So let's take a minute to focus on that human side of things. We've talked about what could happen to the economy with this whole flat tax, tariff-funded UBI system.
Yeah.
But what about the social side? How could this affect people's everyday lives?
That's the big question. And that's what takes us right to the core of the UBI debate. This whole idea of a universal basic income, especially with AI potentially shaking things up in the job market, is a really fascinating concept. I think proponents would argue that it could provide like a safety net, allowing people to adapt and thrive even as certain jobs become automated.
Yeah, I could definitely see how appealing that would be, especially for someone who's, worried about losing their job to a robot.
Hmm.
But let's dig a little deeper into those potential benefits. Like, how could UBI actually make people's lives better?
Well, imagine everyone, no matter if they have a job or not, getting a check regularly that covers their basic needs. It could really reduce financial stress, help with poverty, and just improve overall well-being. There's research that shows that even giving people small amounts of money can have a huge positive impact on their health and happiness.
That makes a lot of sense. When you're constantly stressing about paying bills, it's hard to focus on anything else. But what about that whole argument that people would stop working if they had UBI? Like, if you're getting a guaranteed income, wouldn't that make people less motivated to find a job?
That's a really common concern, but the research actually suggests that it might not be true. There have been several UBI pilot programs around the world, like that one in Finland you mentioned, and they've shown that people don't just quit their jobs when they start getting a basic income. Some studies even show that UBI could actually boost entrepreneurship, like more people might start their own businesses.
So instead of creating a bunch of people who just sit around all day, it could actually give people the power to follow their passions and create new opportunities.
Exactly. UBI could be like a financial cushion that lets people take risks, invest in learning new skills, or start businesses that help their communities. It could lead to a more dynamic and innovative economy, especially as AI takes over those more routine tasks and frees up people to focus on more creative and fulfilling work.
Okay, I could see how that would be a pretty great outcome. But I keep thinking about that funding issue. Even if we agree that UBI could have all these benefits, can we actually pay for it with tariffs without causing a lot of problems in the economy?
It's a valid question, and it's something that economists have been debating for a long time. If I remember that tariffs can be tricky. While they can bring in money, they can also make things more expensive for consumers. That can lead to less spending, and then other countries might retaliate with their own tariffs, which could end up hurting global trade.
Right? It's like walking a tightrope, trying to bring in enough money to fund this huge program, but also trying not to mess everything up and cause economic chaos.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of experts say that if we're really serious about doing UBI, we need to look at other ways to fund it that are more stable and sustainable.
Like what are some of the other options that people have suggested?
Well, one idea that's gaining some traction is a carbon tax. So companies would get taxed based on how much carbon they're putting out. That would not only bring in money, but it would also encourage businesses to be more eco-friendly. It's like a win-win.
That does sound promising.
Mhm.
What else is out there?
Another option is a wealth tax, which would basically be a small tax on the total value of what the richest people own. This could bring in a lot of money without putting a big burden on the middle class or people who are struggling.
Interesting. So it sounds like there are some other good options besides tariffs, even if they might be hard to actually put into practice politically.
For sure. And we have to remember that this whole conversation is still going on. There are no easy answers, and we need to keep looking at different ideas and thinking about the good and bad that could come with each one.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential good and bad of UBI, both in terms of how it could affect people and the challenges of paying for it in a sustainable way. But there's another big thing we need to talk about, right? We can't talk about UBI without talking about AI and how it's going to change the future of work.
You're absolutely right. The rise of AI and how it could replace jobs is one of the main reasons why people are talking about UBI in the first place. Let's be real. The idea that a lot of people could lose their jobs to robots is a scary thought for a lot of people.
It definitely is.
Mhm.
And I can see why. If AI can do things that humans used to do, what happens to those workers? Do they just become irrelevant? That's a pretty depressing thought.
It's a valid concern. But we got to remember that new technologies have always changed the way we work. Think about the Industrial Revolution. When we went from farming to factories, jobs were lost, but new ones were created too.
So you're saying that maybe we shouldn't think of AI as a job killer, but as something that's going to change what work looks like.
Exactly. AI could automate all those boring and repetitive jobs, and that would free up human workers to focus on more complex, creative, and people-focused roles. It could lead to new industries, new types of jobs, and new ways of working that we can't even imagine right now.
But what about the people whose jobs are like the most likely to be replaced by AI, the ones who don't have the skills or resources to adapt to these new types of jobs. That's where UBI would come in, right?
Exactly. UBI could be that safety net during this time of change. Making sure that everyone has at least a basic income, no matter what happens to their job. It could give people the time and space to learn new skills or even try out totally different career paths.
It's like building a bridge between the way work used to be and the way it's going to be in the future. It could help people deal with all this uncertainty and find their place in a world that's changing really fast.
I like that analogy. And it really shows how UBI in the age of AI isn't just about giving people money. It's about giving people the power to adapt, to be creative, and to thrive in a future that's probably going to be very different from today.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential good and bad of UBI in a world where AI is changing everything. It's a complicated issue with no easy answers, but it's clear that this is just the beginning of the conversation, and we need to keep exploring different ideas and talking about this in a thoughtful way.
It really is a complex issue, and as
Right.
we think about this idea of a flat tax and tariffs paying for UBI in the age of AI, it helps to look at some real world examples, see what we can learn.
Yeah. Let's bring this down to earth a bit. Are there any places that have tried something similar to what we've been talking about?
Oh, absolutely. Alaska has had this thing called the permanent fund dividend for years now. It's not exactly UBI, but it's kind of similar. Every resident gets a yearly payment from the state's oil money.
So it's like a mini UBI funded by oil instead of tariffs. What's happened there? Has it made people not want to work?
Well, the research shows that it hasn't really had a big negative impact on people working. People still have jobs, but the dividend gives them some breathing room, especially when the economy's not doing so great. It's also been linked to less poverty and inequality in the state.
Hmm. That's pretty interesting. It seems like it goes against that whole idea that giving people a basic income will make them lazy. Are there any other examples we can look at?
Oh, yeah. There have been tons of smaller UBI pilot programs all over the world. Places like Finland, Kenya, Canada. They give us some good data on how people actually react to getting regular cash payments.
And what have they found?
Well, the early results suggest that UBI can lead to improvements in health, well-being, and even entrepreneurship. People are using the money to cover their basic needs, invest in their skills, or even start small businesses.
Yeah.
It hasn't really caused people to stop working altogether. In a lot of cases, people actually feel more empowered to pursue work that they find meaningful.
That's kind of like what we were talking about before, right? The idea that UBI could give people more freedom and flexibility to adapt to the changing job market.
Exactly. It's not about just giving people money and expecting them to sit around and do nothing. It's about giving them a safety net so they can adapt and thrive in a world where work is changing all the time.
Right. Okay, so these real world examples seem to show that there might be some real benefits here. But I'm guessing there have also been some bumps in the road, maybe some unintended consequences. What can we learn from the problems these programs have run into?
Yeah, for sure. One of the biggest challenges has been figuring out how to pay for it. Alaska's program is kind of unique because it uses oil money, which isn't going to last forever, and the price of oil goes up and down. Other programs have relied on government funding, which can be tough to get and even tougher to keep going over time.
Right. Which brings us right back to those tariffs.
Mhm.
Even if we really like the idea of using tariffs to pay for UBI, is it really smart to rely on them as a stable source of income, given how unpredictable they can be?
That's the million-dollar question. As we've talked about, tariffs come with their own set of risks and potential downsides. They can mess with markets, hurt consumers, and lead to those trade wars we talked about. And the amount of money they bring in can be really up and down depending on what's going on with global trade and the economy as a whole.
So even if we ignore all the potential bad stuff that tariffs can cause, using them to fund a big social program like UBI seems like a pretty risky bet.
Yeah, pretty much. And that's why a lot of economists are saying that if we're really serious about making UBI happen, we need to look at other ways to pay for it. We've already mentioned a few: carbon taxes, wealth taxes, or even just changing our current tax system to make it fair.
It definitely sounds like finding a sustainable and fair way to fund UBI is super important, no matter where the money actually comes from.
Absolutely. And we need to approach this with an open mind, taking everything into consideration.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, exploring this idea of a flat tax and tariffs funding UBI in a world that's becoming more and more driven by AI. What are some key takeaways you would leave our listener with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there are no easy answers when it comes to dealing with the potential impact of AI on our economy and our society. This idea of a flat tax, tariffs, and UBI is definitely something to think about, but we need to do it with a critical and informed eye.
Yeah, we need to really think about the potential benefits and risks explore other options, and have open and honest discussions about what kind of future we want to build.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And to our listener, we encourage you to keep this conversation going. Do your own research, listen to different viewpoints, and think about how these ideas could actually play out in the real world.
It's a super interesting and important conversation, and we all need to be a part of it as we figure out how to navigate this uncharted territory of an AI-driven future. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.